Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Kosick, and I'm the Knowledge Manager for the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment. I want to welcome you to our talk today, Lived Experiences of Potentially Morally Injurious Events in Canadian Public Safety Personnel. We're pleased to be able to bring you this information about this research that was performed by the Atlas Institute for Veterans and Families. Before we get started today, there's just a few housekeeping items I do want to go through. All attendees are in listen-only mode. That's to limit feedback and noise during the presentation. Today's session is being recorded. You will be sent a copy tomorrow, so if you miss anything, you can watch it again. Just so you know, the GoToWebinar launch window can be blocked by some organizations. So if you're having trouble hearing or seeing, you may have to join us by phone. We will be looking for audience questions at the end of the session, so please send us your questions through the questions box or be ready to raise your hand to ask your question. Just so you know, for this session, you can ask your questions in English or French, and we will be able to answer them. We have also placed a number of items for you to access in the handouts box. There's a PDF of today's slides, both in English and French, and a summary of the research that is available, also again in English and French. That summary was prepared by the Atlas Institute based on the research that they did for this presentation. When today's video is posted on the CIPSRT website tomorrow, we will also have a fully French version of the presentation available to view. Now, let me introduce you to our presenter for today. Dr. Sarah Rodriguez is the Director of Applied Research at the Atlas Institute for Veterans and Families, and joining her for the question period to answer any questions in French is Jean-Michel Mercier, a Senior Research Partnerships Associate also at Atlas. So I am going to go ahead and give you presenter control here so you can share your slides. So we are seeing the slides, just not in full screen view. Perfect, displaying perfectly.
How's that looking?
You're good.
Okay, thank you very much, Emily, for the warm welcome, and thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. I am speaking to you today. Sorry, the slide has not moved. There we go, apologies for that. I'm speaking to you today from Treaty 13 territory, the land known today as Toronto, and the traditional and unceded territory of the Wendat, Mississaugas of the Credit, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe peoples. The offices of the Atlas Institute for Veterans and Families are within the Royal Ottawa Hospital on the traditional and unceded territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples in Ottawa. This webinar marks the first public presentation of new research conducted by the Atlas Institute for Veterans and Families on experiences of moral injury in Canadian public safety personnel. As Emily mentioned, I am Sarah Rodriguez, Director of Applied Research at the Atlas Institute and one of the principal investigators of this study. I'm pleased to be here today to share these findings with you. Firdaus Hosseini, President and CEO of the Atlas Institute, was the co-principal investigator on this study. I would also like to acknowledge and thank researchers at the Atlas Institute who worked with us on this project. Jean-Michel Mercier, Senior Research Partnerships Associate, who is here today, Molly Nanaroni, Research Coordinator, and Adelia McCall, Research Coordinator. And we also thank Shannon Tracy, who led the knowledge mobilization efforts on this project. The Atlas Institute thanks the Royal Ottawa, who was a partner on this study, and the frontline PSP leaders, researchers, and mental health professionals who served on its advisory committee. Funding from Veterans Affairs Canada, makes the work of the Atlas Institute possible. We are also grateful to our colleagues at CIPSRT for hosting this webinar today. To begin, I will offer some background on the construct of moral injury, what it is, and why it is relevant to public safety personnel, as a way to contextualize and offer a rationale for the study that we conducted. Then I will present a selection of the major findings of our recently completed study in relation to the types of events that public safety personnel identify as potentially morally injurious, how they make sense of these events, and the impact of these events on their well-being and identity. To conclude, I will share some recommendations for how individuals, team leaders, and organizations can manage the impacts of moral injury. After the presentation, Jean-Michel and I will be available for questions in English and in French. The notion of moral injury was identified in the 1990s when clinicians working with veterans noted that the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, did not sufficiently capture the full and lasting extent of veterans' experiences or outcomes, particularly during and because of deployment. They determined that while PTSD captures the symptoms associated with experiences that are psychologically traumatizing, it misses the impact of those situations in which military members faced or witnessed events that they found difficult to make sense of, or that led to the violation of their core beliefs. Dr. Jonathan Shea was among the first to identify the notion of moral injury, and among the first to offer a definition of the construct. He defined moral injury as, quote, a betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation. Many definitions of moral injury are now present in the research literature, and while there is not yet a consensus on its definition, one of the most commonly cited definitions used presently is likely that of Dr. Brettlitz et al., which references the psychological, social, and spiritual impact of events that involve betrayal or transgression of one's own deeply held moral beliefs and values as they occur in high-stakes situations. Given this history, there is overlap between moral injury and PTSD. A person can simultaneously live with both moral injury and PTSD, but moral injury is also distinct from PTSD in that it can occur without exposure to direct harm or life-threatening circumstances. Also, moral injury may not elicit the same psychological or physical symptoms that PTSD does. And unlike PTSD, moral injury is not a formal diagnosis, in that it does not appear in the DSM-5 or the ICD-11. In the moral injury literature, the situations that may contribute to the lasting outcomes associated with moral injury are called potentially morally injurious events, or PMIEs, and I will use this acronym throughout the presentation. Exposure to PMIEs has been associated with higher risk of mental health problems, including depression, suicidal ideation, problematic substance use, and PTSD. Left unaddressed, they can also lead to moral injury. Potentially morally injurious events can be roughly divided into two main categories. First, moral transgressions that involve people doing or failing to do something, whether deliberately or unwittingly. Or second, direct or indirect exposure to another's transgressions, such as a betrayal or bearing witness to grave inhumanity. Over the past several years, researchers and frontline professionals have indicated that moral injury is relevant in non-military occupational contexts as well. Moral injury came to the forefront of advocacy efforts and research in the healthcare context, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, moral injury has been circulating healthcare discourse for several years as healthcare professionals themselves have been raising concerns about the fact that they are repeatedly expected to make choices that transgress their morals, values, and ethics. Concurrently, there has been discussion of moral injury in public safety, including among paramedics and law enforcement. Research into moral injury in public safety personnel remains nascent, but there has been some considerable study, for example, of how public safety personnel cope with and grow from stressful and traumatic experiences. This literature has also noted the moral and ethical challenges that are inherent in this line of work. Examples of some of these challenges are on the slide here. With these in mind, moral injury may offer a novel and applicable lens through which to understand and manage the psychological distress or harms that are associated with public safety occupations. The main objectives of our study were two. One, understand the types of experiences that public safety personnel identify as potentially morally injurious events. Two, understand how public safety personnel make sense of or interpret these experiences. And three, explore how these events impact well-being and how PSP cope with them, including if peer support is part of this coping process and if it's part of how they cope with the feelings associated with moral injury. This is the front cover of the report and a link to where it can be found, and this will also be posted for your information in the chat. I will speak for a moment about the methods that guided the study. We conducted semi-structured one-on-one interviews in English and French between March and July of 2021 with 38 people who work for a public safety organization in Ontario that provides paramedic services. The participants were primary or advanced care paramedics, communications officials, or logistics technicians, or were in a leadership position in the organization. I'll offer a couple of quick explanatory notes here before I go any further. For this study, we used the term public safety personnel, or PSP for short, to collectively describe the participants, and this is in accordance with CIPSRT's recommended term in the glossary of terms. All names are pseudonyms, and in some situations, details have been changed slightly to protect the identities of the participants. I'm also going to note that while in giving examples of types of PMIEs or impacts of PMIEs, we're focusing on one or two pieces of narrative evidence per point, but there is much more to be found in our full report. During the interviews, PSP were asked to describe work events that transgress their morals, values, or ethics, why these events were morally or ethically problematic, how they understand and make sense of these events, and how these events impacted them. And findings related to these areas of inquiry will be the focus of today's presentation. Our complete findings, including those related to coping strategies and to peer support, are detailed in our research report, which, as I mentioned, is on the Atlas Institute's website. Before I discuss findings related to the types of events that violate PSP morals, values, or ethics, I will first speak for a moment about what PSP who participated in this study identified as their core beliefs. We found that there was a group of values that was common to participants, and that these are the values that led them to and keep them motivated in their work and life. When asked about their core beliefs or what they value, professionally as well as personally, PSP cited wanting to make a difference, wanting to help others, a belief in fairness, kindness, honesty, trust, and integrity. And notably, PSP were commonly guided by the golden rule to treat others as they themselves would want to be treated, and the do no harm principle. PSP routinely faced situations that transgress these deeply held beliefs. Our study uncovered that for PSP, potentially morally injurious situations fit three broad categories. The first are micro-level potentially morally injurious events, and these are those that are related to the nature of the work itself, at the bottom of your screen. The second are meso-level PMIEs, and these are those that are caused by or attributed to the organizational climate or culture in which PSP work. The third are macro-level PMIEs, and these are those that arose to or were attributed to issues within the broader healthcare or social welfare systems. You will see as I present that there is some overlap in these categories and that they are not discrete. When we explored potentially morally injurious events related to the nature of the work that PSP do, many described moral and ethical violations on the job, that is, during a call or while completing job-related duties. And these occurred because of something that they did or did not do, or because of something that someone else did or did not do. This included treating people who have done harm to others, having to provide treatment that they believe to be harmful or futile, and being unable to provide treatment. To begin, one type of potentially morally injurious event that originated from PSP actions included situations in which PSP have to treat people who have caused harm to others or whose actions they may find reprehensible. Several PSP described their concern over having to respond to car accidents caused by drinking and driving, and having to treat the abuser during a domestic violence call. Pam, a paramedic, described a situation in which she responded to a call to treat a convicted sex offender. She said, quote, "One time, getting called to care for somebody who was a pedophile. At the time, my daughter, pardon me, was probably 3 or 4 years old, and I'm having to deal with this guy that, like every fiber of my being, was just like, I want you to rot in hell." For PSP, these types of events prompted a conflict between their moral code and their duty to provide care, which was difficult to reconcile. Another type of potentially morally injurious event arose during situations in which PSP are compelled to provide treatment that in their professional judgment is harmful or futile. This was the case for Brenda, who felt that she had no choice but to comply with a policy of immobilizing an elderly fall patient using a backboard, even though in her assessment it wasn't necessary. Quote, "By the time we got to the hospital, he was starting to get really agitated. He was very uncomfortable. He wanted out. He was screaming in pain. Now he had back pain. He didn't before, now he does. And that's really difficult to deal with when you're called to, help make a patient feel better. And I made his whole situation worse." That's one example where I found was morally wrong. For PSP who face these situations, the risks or harm posed by a course of action outweighed its benefits. The distress of seeing patients either put at risk, not helped, or actively harmed by treatment they administered was exacerbated by their impression that they did not have the ability to do things differently or in accordance with the circumstances. PSP also described situations in which they were unable to provide treatment to patients. This occurred in situations where those with oversight who provide direction to PSP with which the PSP does not agree with, as in this situation described by Jack. Quote, "I was given directions from a physician to stop resuscitation on someone. I didn't feel we should stop. I felt that there was still a chance. So that was a morally difficult situation where I'm being told to do one thing, and I don't feel it's the appropriate decision." Like situations in which PSP are compelled to provide treatment they deem harmful or futile, being unable to provide treatment is also distressing because they are unable to help others. Consequently, their ability to act in accordance with their values is compromised. While this quote is not on the slide, I will read it from another participant named Skylar, who shared that helping people is an inherent quality in PSP. Quote, "It's in our nature. We had a passion for helping people and to providing medicine. So then to sit there and just not do anything when somebody's having a medical emergency just feels so wrong and against everything that got you into the job." The second type of micro-level, potentially morally injurious event occurred when PSP were faced with events or situations where they witnessed someone else fail to act or act in a way that to them was not right. These situations occurred when PSP witnessed colleagues or trusted authorities being lazy or careless in their work, doing things that constituted negligence or neglect, or disrespecting or not showing compassion to others. For example, Julian described a situation in which his partner chose to not medicate a patient who was in pain. Julian said he, the patient, was hurting. So by the end of the call, I told my partner, "We should at least put him on the stretcher, at least let him lay down, why didn't you medicate? We should do something for him." And as much as I want to jump in and do something, it was his call. So I can suggest as much as I want, but at the end of the day, it's up to him. Henry, also a paramedic, spoke about a situation in which a decision made by his partner led to negative consequences for their patient. Quote, "I knew there was a risk, but my partner decided. He was a higher medical authority and I followed his lead, and it was an adverse outcome for that patient. So that was very, very hard on me." Henry and Julian identified these situations as ones that transgressed their values, yet their deference to their partner hindered their ability to do what they thought was right. Our findings also indicate that the organizational culture and climate was a source of potentially morally injurious events. At this meso level, PMIEs that originated from the organizational culture or climate were those related to the norms, behaviors, and attitudes of that environment. Events in this category included unmet needs or concerns, being silenced or pressured to concede, exposure to a toxic or hostile environment, or being subject to unjust discipline or sanctions. And here I will focus on the first two of these. PSP shared experiences of situations where their health or well-being needs went unmet by the organization. In particular, many spoke about the problem and the implications of not having breaks during shifts or inadequate time to decompress following difficult calls. As Oliver put it, quote, so basically, if communications calls you, it's like, okay, we need coverage here. We need you to go here. It's like, well, hang on a second. Like, we need a few minutes to, get our headspace back. And then they jump right to, well, are you refusing to do the call? Like, it becomes an adversary instantly. So you have no other option but to go to that call. Now you're dragging the last trauma into this one. PSP also spoke about situations in which their concerns were not taken seriously by trusted authorities, when they were pressured by leadership to rescind complaints or told not to talk about complaints that they had made. Camilla, in communications, filed a complaint about a coworker and was troubled by the response she received from a member of leadership who said, "Don't worry, someone will talk to him, but do not repeat this to anyone." This would reflect very badly on the service and maybe yourself. In reflecting on this, Camilla said that at the time, "I could not believe my ears, and I don't believe in being made to feel like something bad could happen to you if you say the truth about an experience you've had." The third source of potentially morally injurious events were issues and failures pertaining to the healthcare system. These related to its broader aspects like governance, regulations, service delivery or provision, and workforce distribution. Specifically, PSP experienced distress in the face of a system that compromises or precludes worker autonomy, that puts priorities, policies, and politics at odds with each other, and is chronically under pressure. One issue that arose frequently was that of how long-standing underfunding of the healthcare and social welfare systems makes public safety personnel responsible for duties for which they are untrained. As Shirley put it, quote, "We're not social workers, we're not therapists, that's not our job. My job is cardiac arrest, respiratory, cancer, pain control, stuff like that. That's my job." And you get put in these situations where you literally have, it's not your job, but there's nobody else to call, so this is what you're doing. Although they fulfill these duties because they want to help, many shared that these situations take them away from what they deem, quote unquote, real emergencies. PS spoke about how under-resourcing combines with increased demands on the healthcare system and impacts the work of PSP. She said, quote, "There's a political pressure to have ambulances. And I say ambulances because that's not how they see us. That's how they see us, not as humans. Put back on the road as soon as possible. And it doesn't matter really what's happened. The goal is to finish a call and get back out there. It's a political pressure that we've been playing with for a very long time, that we're understaffed, that we are overused, that we're overworked. And that pressure comes down to our superiors to get us back on the road, and that's the goal." In addition to exploring the types of events that PSP identify as potentially morally injurious, this study also considered how they interpret and make sense of these events, specifically in terms of why these events transgress morals, values, or ethical principles. PSP's interpretations of the moral and ethical implications of the event fit one of three categories. PSP felt that they had no choice in the matter. The situation broke their trust in leadership or the organization, or it generated a sense of inner conflict. First, many PSP felt that despite knowing a course of action wasn't right, they had no choice but to comply. Many struggle to reconcile what they believe ought to have been done in a situation with the institutional decisions and policies that they have to follow, especially when there are consequences for patient care or safety. As Grant put it, when speaking about a situation in which he was directed by the overseeing physician to continue resuscitation, quote, "I felt not comfortable whatsoever because there's no benefit. It was just best to kind of leave him be and let family have their wish and let him have his final wish. But unfortunately, we were just stuck between a rock and a hard place, and we just had to proceed." Second, being caught between policy and doing the right thing produced for some a persistent sense of inner conflict, who struggle to determine if doing the right thing is worth the risk. Howard said, quote, "I'm basically forced to decide, do I want to potentially risk my income and risk my job by doing good patient care and maybe prevent somebody from dying because of a medical issue? That's the choice I get to make frequently. Like, That's not a good position to be in. Finally, these experiences undermine and break the trust that PSP place in leadership, whether that's to provide stability and consistency, to protect them, or to uphold the espoused values of the organization. Thea, a paramedic, had made a request for workplace accommodation. That request was denied, and she wanted to appeal the decision, but she relented in the face of intimidation and bullying by leadership. She said that the experience prompted a critical reevaluation of her view of the organization. Quote, "You think that they're going to be a good parent and do the right thing, but they're not. The organization is not here for us, to support us. Eventually, I had to drop it. At that point, I flipped from, oh, your supervisors know what's best, what's the right thing, to F you guys. That experience represented a big turning point of my morals and my view of how an organization that says, we're going to take care of you, we care about your mental health, we care about your well-being, we care about your health and safety, we care about you coming forward, blah, 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 blah. It's not true." In addition to different types of potentially morally injurious events and how PSP makes sense of them, we also asked about the impacts that they associate with or experience as a result of the potentially morally injurious events that they described. Before I discuss these specific impacts, it is important to address that they were more often than not the result of a combination of recurring potentially morally injurious events, routine stress, and frequent exposure to traumatic situations, rather than the result of one specific potentially morally injurious event. Here are some of the overall physical and mental health impacts and personal and professional impacts that participants self-reported. With regard to the emotional responses mentioned by PSP, anger and frustration were the most predominantly cited ones. Rick, in communications, spoke of his frustration with the use of paramedic services to support non-emergency mental health calls. He said, quote, "I can sympathize with these people who are in complete crisis, who have no help or support and often end up in the revolving door of the system, which is go to the hospital, get booted out, and then call us again the next day and do the same thing over and over again. It's hard not to feel frustrated when, not at them, but at the system." PSP also felt helpless and resigned, particularly when the circumstance was one in which they did not have autonomy or authority, or in which they were reminded of their relative powerlessness in the organization or healthcare system. Sam discussed the impact of the problem of dispatching paramedics to non-emergency calls ahead of emergency calls, and put it this way, quote, "You know that every minute counts when somebody's vital signs absent, and you're like, why are we responding to this non-emergency call? And there's no power for us or supervisor to say, okay, I'm going to take liberty to downgrade this call to bump this one out. That's for liability reasons. We have no power. Put protocol in place and just follow it." For many, these events eroded their will to advocate for what is right. Some, like Anthony, explicitly tied this to moral injury, saying, quote, "When you're talking about moral injury, I feel like if anything, it's one of those like long-term erosions of like your willingness to stand up for things, absolutely. Especially in this kind of workplace, you have to weigh the risks and the benefits for some of the decisions that you make, not only on yourself, but on your colleagues and on the patients. And after a while, I will admit, you just stop caring." We also found that these events have personal and professional consequences for PSP. Many reported negative impacts on their performance at work in terms of their ability to concentrate or focus, and impacts on their overall morale. Some noted that the toll of the job led them to withdraw from social life. Thea shared that she withdrew from her friends, but also from community involvement. She said, quote, "I dropped a bunch of extra things that I had done, volunteer things that I had been active in. I will bail on plans with friends, and that has cost me friendships because I flaked too many times because I couldn't deal." several PSP expressed that their work has affected their perception of themselves or who they understand themselves to be as individuals. Some of these consequences align with those commonly associated with moral injury. Pam shared that, quote, "My biggest complaint about my profession is the impact it has on me as a person. I definitely feel shut off, and I feel like I assume the worst in people, and I'm always looking for what's wrong in people. For me, it's a moral problem because it's degraded aspects of me that are human, that connect with other people." While Audrey noted a change in her disposition and said, quote, "I have never been as angry as I am in the last probably year and a half. It's not my personality at all. I don't like it. It's not who I am at the core." And finally, Brenda identified a change in who she had become as a result of PSP work following years of moral compromise. Quote, "I didn't like who I was becoming and what the system was turning me into. In order for me to live and function in that system, I had to break my morals and I had to not care in order to survive. And I was terrified about who I was becoming. It was my soul that is broken and that is damaged from the difficult stuff that I see and that I deal with. But I think I was just also broken by the system and I was just done." These PSP express sentiments that indicate that repeated exposure to a combination of potentially morally injurious events, stress, and traumatic events has eroded their self-concept. In this way, they recognize the existential impact of the job in terms of the changes that they observe in who they are. Our findings reveal that potentially morally injurious events are, in fact, a feature of the PSP experience, and that moral injury as a construct resonates with many of the PSP who participated in this study. From situations related directly to duties associated with their role, to situations attributable to the organizational culture or broader healthcare system, these events occur because of an interaction of multiple factors, with potential impacts that we found cut across the personal and professional lives of PSP. We also found that the origin of the potentially morally injurious event, whether at the micro, meso, or macro level, was related to its impact on PSP well-being. While we didn't have much time to articulate this in our presentation today, our report goes into a bit more detail about how job-related potentially morally injurious events, although distressing, appear not quite as problematic for some PSP, as they were expected as part of the job and thus perhaps easier to accept. Our results suggest that PSP may be more strongly distressed by potentially morally injurious events that stem from the organization or the broader healthcare system, as these were unexpected and not something that they had been prepared to face. The results of the study suggest the types, interpretations, and impact of potentially morally injurious events for PSP both overlap and diverge with what has been concluded by research on military and veteran populations. They overlap considerably as well with emergent research on PSP populations and moral injury. Our study found that the potentially morally injurious events and impacts that PSP experience are qualitatively different from those of military and veteran populations, and thus we suggest it may be helpful for new research to consider the development of a unique framework for the identification and management of moral injury in PSP. To conclude today's presentation, I will share some insights from the existing literature, including some from Atlas Institute resources, in terms of how individuals and leaders might address potentially morally injurious events and moral injury in the workplace. Before we talk about how to recognize moral injury, it's important to contextualize some of these points. As I noted earlier, moral injury is not yet fully defined, and its features, such as anger, guilt, and shame, have much in common with other mental health problems and other forms of distress. Therefore, we don't want to assume that because someone has experienced a potentially morally injurious event, that they have moral injury. We risk pathologizing individuals if we immediately conclude that the expressions of symptoms are moral injury. It's important to note that following an experience of a potentially morally injurious event, that moral distress is understandable, but this distress may resolve with time. Awareness of moral injury is important, but it may be easier to recognize and help people with the features of moral injury that are behavioral, like isolation or withdrawal, lack of purposeful behavior, and aggression. As potentially morally injurious events can occur at multiple levels, responding to them requires efforts and change at multiple levels. At a leadership level, if you think a colleague has experienced a potentially morally injurious event or moral injury, create a safe space to discuss it. Acknowledge the moral stressors or difficulties that are inherent in the work. Listen with patience and compassion, and encourage them to take care of themselves, engaging in activities not just that they enjoy, but that they derive meaning from, and that foster social connectedness. At an individual level, it's important to identify the supportive people in your life in order to create an atmosphere of acceptance around you and to build or rebuild strong social attachments. If need be, consider professional support. Mental health professionals help people talk about and process reactions and feelings in a confidential and supportive environment. In terms of treatments, although some have been developed for moral injury, namely acceptance and commitment therapy, current research is still in development, although there are some promising trials underway. In addition to our new research report, the Atlas Institute has other resources available on its website to provide more information on moral injury in an occupational context and how to mitigate its impacts. These resources provide tools, templates, and tips for understanding what preventative and early intervention strategies or structures might already be in place in the organization. They also provide information for how to identify what more might be needed and how to support and make change. The moral injury section of our website has more information about all of these resources. Thank you for joining us today for this presentation of our research, and I will now open it up for Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Rodriguez, for that fabulous presentation. It's always very impactful to hear words directly from PSP about their experience. I do just want to, I'm going to go ahead and start with a question if you don't mind, and I will ask you to answer in English, and then I will get Jean-Michel to answer in French if you don't mind. Did you notice any differences in how PSP in this study spoke about their feelings associated with moral injury compared to how veterans talk about it?
Yeah, happy to start there, Emily. Thank you very much for the question. I think that the key difference that we noticed in terms of how PSP spoke about the emotions, reactions, feelings that they associated with these events was anger, frustration, helplessness, resignation. These were the key emotional reactions that came from public safety personnel that we don't see, and what we did not see was guilt and shame, which are the common reactions that are spoken about in the literature on military and veteran populations.
Okay. Jean-Michel, if you want to go ahead and answer in French.
Sure, I'll just repeat the question in French as well. So the question itself was, c'est quoi la différence ou est-ce qu'il y avait des différences dans les résultats qui ont été obtenus dans cette étude si, avec les PSP en comparaison avec les militaires et les vétérans? Et la réponse était, la plus grosse différence était par rapport à la honte et la culpabilité. Donc, c'est deux choses qu'on n'a pas nécessairement entendues dans les participants de cette étude, qui revient souvent dans la littérature avec les vétérans et les militaires. Donc, ce qu'on a entendu, c'était plutôt par rapport à la frustration et la colère. Donc, c'est ça la plus grosse différence, c'est qu'on n'a pas nécessairement entendu par rapport à la culpabilité et la honte.
Okay. So next question, and Jean-Michel, I'll get you to start first, is in the presentation you spoke to the health and well-being impacts. How do PMIEs play a role in that?
Donc, la question, c'était par rapport aux conséquences en termes de la santé et le bien-être. Donc, c'est de quelle façon que les EPPM, donc les événements potentiellement préjudiciaires sur le plan moral, ont eu un impact sur la santé et le bien-être de PSP. Et la réponse par rapport à ça, c'était vraiment, ça fait partie d'une combinaison. Donc, il y avait c'est par rapport à du stress quotidien. Tu avais les EPPM qui sont dans cette combinaison-là aussi. Et tu avais les événements traumatiques qui se produisaient aussi par rapport aux appels, par rapport au travail. Donc, c'était pas nécessairement associé, les impacts qui ont été présentés, c'était pas seulement associé aux APPM, mais ça faisait partie d'une combinaison de toutes ces choses-là, et c'est là qu'on a entendu les impacts. On ne s'est pas relié spécifiquement à un événement ou à un APPM.
And Dr. Rodriguez, if you want to answer that question as well about the health and well-being impacts.
Yeah, certainly. Perhaps, Jean-Michel, could you translate the response and then I'll add anything? That might be just so that we don't repeat each other.
Sure. So the response was that the mental health or the impacts that you spoke about were not related specifically to only PMIEs or one specific PMIEs, but that the PMIEs were part of a combination of routine stress, as you had mentioned in the presentation. It's part of routine stress, traumatic experiences, and then the PMIEs, and that's where those impacts came from. So PMIEs contributed to those impacts as part of that combination, but weren't specifically or the sole reason for those impacts that were presented.
And I don't have anything to add to that response. That was comprehensive. Thank you, Jan.
Perfect. All right, so the next question we do have is if you guys did study anyone beyond paramedics or communicators, such as corrections.
I can start there. So no, the study didn't include corrections or any law enforcement or border officials. It was paramedics, both advanced and primary care, logistics technicians who are part of the organization and who sometimes do work with the paramedics directly on the road. And so that's the group of PSP who they equip vehicles for going onto the road. And we also talk to communications officials who are call takers and dispatchers.
Okay. So we do have somebody who just wants to let you know, excellent presentation. They are a public servant on leave, and much of what you described reflected their experience working in public policy, attempting to address systemic issues upstream. Have you considered extending your PSP framework to include policy folks?
We hadn't considered extending the framework to include policy folks. I think that it would be a very interesting line of inquiry to see whether moral injury is a concept or construct that is relevant to other types of occupations. What we have seen in the literature that we've become familiar with over the last couple of years is that in addition to public safety personnel, healthcare workers, and of course military and veteran populations, there has been some discussion about journalists, for example, being a group that could potentially be at risk for moral injury due to the nature of the work that we do. So by extension, I think that policy analysts or advisors or other types of public servants could be an interesting line of inquiry. Hadn't considered that, but thank you very much for the recommendation.
Okay, so a question that has come in French is, what is the difference between psychological wounds and moral wounds, or is there one?
Yeah, Dr. Rodriguez, you want to take that one first? I'll translate and then add.
That is a very good question. I think that what I would like to do there is do a little bit more re-review of the literature, if we'd be able to, and happy to provide a more detailed response. If that person would like to get in touch with us, we can put the email address in the chat. I think that's a much more complex question, and we want to provide the most comprehensive response possible.
So, donc, ouais, c'est une excellente question qui est quand même très complexe et avant de répondre, sans avoir de réponse juste comme ça, ce qu'on aimerait faire, c'est de retourner de notre côté, faire un petit peu plus de recherche dans la littérature pour pouvoir vraiment bien répondre à la question. Mais merci pour la question, c'est une excellente question.
Okay, perfect. So we do have a question from the audience. David, I am going to go ahead and unmute your microphone if you want to go ahead and ask it.
Okay, so it is a little bit longer, so that's why I didn't want to try to type it all in. So it's associated to your comment about the that there was an expectation of challenges that come with the job, which was a protective factor in a sense, and also your comment about that not all PMEs will result in moral injury. So in your research, and the reason why I'm asking is because this is the direction that my dissertation idea is heading, is did you find any who said that their identity or their spiritual beliefs or their core beliefs were that actually became a protective factor for them when they were experiencing these events on the job? or where there were PMIEs, that did they result in a positive change in their identity or beliefs?
I'm just taking a quick note of the question. Give me one moment, David.
Yeah, okay, it was a big question.
So one thing I am recalling as I'm taking note of this is that we actually did not have a lot of participants speak in too much detail about spiritual beliefs. That was actually less common than I think I would have expected, just given the nature of, people being religious or not. So that was quite surprising. In terms of identity, we did ask people about how identity impacted how they responded or interpreted to potentially morally injurious events, or whether or not identity was a relevant factor in terms of what they thought was or wasn't potentially morally injurious. And in this respect, we found that it was often the case that life experience had quite an impact on what people thought was potentially morally injurious. And so, people who were parents tended to identify situations involving children as being potentially morally injurious, and people who had experienced adverse childhood events then had associated incidents involving domestic violence or assault with potentially morally injurious events. So there was kind of a link there between identity and life experience and what was salient in terms of moral injury or potentially morally injurious events. Jean-Michel, anything to add to that? And I can do a little bit more thinking as we're chatting.
No, I think the same as you mentioned at the start, it was in terms of the spirituality aspect, it's not something that we, which was a little bit surprising, as you mentioned, that we heard really about participants. But that, yeah, the identity, to your point, is I don't have much to add on what you mentioned in terms of the identity. It was those that could relate to specific events that they went through, or maybe a little bit more affected to that point, but then not much about the spirituality.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm also looking at maybe spirituality and identity as to some people is the same sort of thing. So did you find that, you talk about that, there were the people's history, their adverse childhood experiences or their identities as being a parent where they might see more moral injury, but did you see the opposite where that identity might be a protective factor? And that those events, because of their experiences at those events, they did not see those events as potentially morally injurious, where many others would.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Jean-Michel and I would want to go back to the findings in a bit more detail, but off the top of my head, I'm inclined to say no, that was not the case.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, David. All right. So I will move on to another question from the audience box here. I myself run a support group for PSP with PTSD, and I'm wondering what your recommendations are for how to approach moral injury in person.
I can start with that one. So I would come back to some of the recommendations that I shared at the end of the presentation around creating a safe space, acknowledging the moral stressors that are inherent to that line of work, listening with compassion, and encouraging people to take care of themselves. And one of the things that I stressed here as well was to encourage people to engage in activities, not just that they enjoy, but that they derive meaning from or that foster social connectedness. Because moral injury is, it is a type of experience that leads people to question their trust in other people, in the world around them, and that really has an adverse I'm not sure why I said income, outcome on how they see the world and other people around them. And we saw that in some of the narrative evidence that I shared right towards the end of the presentation about how people's worldview was compromised, and they sort of lost their belief in the world. So activities that foster social connection are really part of what is recommended for helping people to mitigate the impacts of moral injury or the impacts of potentially morally injurious events. I hope that that's helpful.
Jean-Michel, perhaps we can answer that in French as well.
Sure. Donc, la question, c'était par rapport à quelqu'un qui voulait, qui se demandait comment, s'il y avait des recommandations en termes d'aider leurs pairs avec, de gérer ça, les préjudices moraux et les APPM. Et ce que Dr. Rodriguez mentionnait, c'est peut-être ce qui était présenté à la fin de la présentation, c'était par rapport à de recommander de participer dans des activités non seulement qui aiment, mais aussi des activités dans lesquelles qui ont une connexion et qui leur rapportent vraiment plus que juste du plaisir. Donc, vraiment, des choses qui les reconnectent à leur vie, qui sont vraiment passionnés. Parce que une des choses par rapport aux préjudices moraux puis aux APPM, ce qui pourrait mener en termes des conséquences associées aux préjudices moraux, c'est vraiment la dégradation vraiment du point de vue du monde autour d'eux autres. Donc, participer dans des activités qui peuvent vraiment rapporter ce plaisir-là, la connexion au monde autour d'eux, ce serait une des recommandations en termes de comment, en personne, aider des pairs avec ces choses-là.
Next question is, I'm a psychologist listening in and finding this quite helpful. Can you say a bit more about the types of therapeutic interventions that are shown to be helpful in reducing moral injury? I believe you mentioned ACT.
Yeah, that is the one that we're most familiar with. To be honest, off the top of my head, could not speak in too much detail about what is involved in ACT because we do work on the research team. And I wouldn't want to say anything that wouldn't be accurate in this particular context. And from what I know, ACT has not been adapted for public safety personnel. So I think that that's another thing that I would want to mention here. There is another program that is called Impacted Killing, and I don't know where that is. That is for military veteran populations. And I don't know what the specifics of that treatment are as well. So don't want to comment too much on specific therapies in this particular context, but happy to connect over email to provide a little bit more information we can discuss with our colleagues and share that.
Okay, so we're getting a lot of comments about other sectors needing a similar awareness around moral injury. And I'm just wondering if you guys have any plans to be either expanding it yourselves or advocating for more expansion on the study of moral injury in like firefighters or corrections, so that more generalized policies perhaps can be made around that. That is an amalgamation of several questions.
Yeah. Jean-Michel, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. So in the as Dr. Rodriguez mentioned at the start, so this the concept first originated in the military veteran population, and just very recently is sort of being explored as a concept in the PSP. So with police, firefighters, correctional officers. So there's the literature itself is still very new for moral injury, especially outside of the military veteran context. So a lot more research is needed to expand to see if it resonates in other contexts as well. But again, it's still very new, and I think the pandemic sort of gave it a bit of a boost outside of the military veteran context. But yeah, still more research is definitely needed to see if it applies to, or if it resonates in the other ones. Do you have anything to add there, Dr. Rodriguez?
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and unmute Greg. You do have your hand up for a question. You are just self-muted at the moment, so just go ahead and unmute yourself to ask that question, Greg.
Hi there, can you hear me?
I can.
Thank you. It's been a great presentation. I'm an advanced care paramedic. I don't know if I should say this or not, but in Nova Scotia, sadly experienced a moral injury. At the time, discussing with my psychologist, we actually used that term, but I was not. He may have been, but not fully cognizant of the kind of research that was being done in that area. The moral injury, kind of the way I viewed it, was triggered, as you saw in some of the questionnaires answered by PSP across the country, not so much by patient care contact, although that can be quite challenging, but by the corporate or leadership environment that kind of leaves you out hanging high and dry too often. And so that creates that top-down, I guess, corporate culture that no matter what the individual does, you're still returning day in, day out to a toxic environment, not your fellow paramedics or the patients that you deal with. And so the moral injury, if I put it in terms of our military veterans, it cracks your armor, your personal armor that you develop over time to be able to do the job of a paramedic or an ER nurse. And then in my case, that's when full-blown PTSD developed, all the symptomology that comes along with that. So my question is, in your research or in looking at what the military is doing, are there any programs and training, not just for individuals at the front lines like myself, but that can be administered or delivered to senior leadership, middle management, frontline management, that can work towards changing the culture? Because if we can't change the culture, and I'll refer to someone fairly famous, General Blair, if we can't change the culture, then the injuries will continue to happen. So are there any already right now, any out of the box or pre-built programs that you're aware of that could be shared with or delivered to the leadership side of PSP?
Thank you very much for the comment and question, Greg, and for sharing your experience with us. I'm sure that it seems that you may have seen some overlap between a lot of what we presented and a lot of what you just shared here now. I am not aware of any programs specifically that target organizational leadership, whether that's in a healthcare context, a public safety context, to mitigate the creation of or damage caused by a toxic or hostile work environment. So I'm not aware of any programs specifically, but we are aware of, and we are creating at the Atlas Institute, a lot of resources and toolkits that public safety and healthcare leaders can use to improve their organizations and to mitigate the creation and to help mitigate and manage, I should say, the impact of potentially morally injurious events and moral injury in the workplace.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Greg. So we do have a question. Now, you've kind of answered a little bit of this first part of it, but it's a two-part question. The first is, what does the current body of literature regarding moral injury in PSP look like? And the second part is, how is this research unique when you compare it to other studies on the topic? So you have answered the first one a little bit, but I'll go ahead and if there's anything you wanted to add.
Yeah, so I'll say a little bit in relation to the first part of the question, and there's quite a bit more on this in our report, of course. There's a bit of a contextualizing section that provides a summary of the literature. So as we provide in the report, the concept of moral injury emerged in military and veteran populations and has now been recognized in other occupational contexts. And there's still a bit of consensus building that needs to be done to identify what exactly moral injury is in these occupational contexts. I think that what our study offers that is unique is that we are looking at a population that has not yet been studied in terms of moral injury in a really comprehensive way, particularly in the Canadian context. So I think what we're offering here is a spotlight on what might be going on in different settings than what the literature is currently considering. Now, having said that, I will remind everybody that our study was a single-sided qualitative study. So it does limit the generalizations or conclusions that we might be able to draw about what might be going on in other public safety organizations and settings across the country. So it does have that particular limitation, but I think that what we're offering that is different is an indication of what is going on with a different population. Because as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there is quite a bit of literature about paramedics and communications officials and some of the traumatic experiences that what traumatic experiences are common in the work and how they cope with them and the effects that that has. But moral injury is a lens that hasn't quite yet been applied to this particular workplace context. I hope that that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so we do have a few questions around how, and I think this comes down to me for like a knowledge translation kind of question. How do you plan to share this research widely to encourage leadership to start, leadership in PSP organizations to start looking at this and to become more educated about moral injury in their service?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent question. I'll start and then maybe turn it over to Jam to add in any details that I may have missed. So we're doing presentations like this one. We're also presenting at CIMVR Forum next week in Halifax, a much shorter version of the presentation, but we're on a symposium with a couple of colleagues who are also presenting on moral injury and public safety personnel. We have a plain language summary and an executive summary in addition to the report that is available on our website. So those are additional resources that people can directly access to find out more about the findings in a different format. We have, what am I missing? What are our other plans? We are working with a group of public safety personnel to create a series of case studies that draw on the literature in combination with these findings to provide direct education, for lack of a better word, to frontline PSP about how to recognize the signs of moral injury or potentially the impacts of potentially morally injurious events in their colleagues. Those are the things that come to mind. Jean-Michel, anything to add?
I think you went through the entire list of everything that we're trying to do, and the biggest thing was to make it as accessible as possible and to reach as many people as possible. So all of the things that you mentioned were really to that end, is to make that as accessible as possible.
Okay, perfect. So we are at the end of our time. We did have a few more questions. Were you able to stay for a couple of minutes? We can there's just one particular question I think that's probably worth addressing, if you're okay with that.
So you can fill one more question, Emily, thank you.
Perfect. So the question is, how did participant race or gender considerations impact their individual experiences and your research findings?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I think a really good one that we were certainly expecting. We did look into this in our study. So before people as they were enrolled into the study, we asked people to do a bit of a demographic survey. And then depending on the information that they provided to them, we asked them about how those characteristics or axes of identity influenced the types of potentially morally injurious events that they identified, or how they reacted or responded to them. And while I will mention that we did not have a large number of people who identified as BIPOC or as LGBTQ+ in our study, we found that of those people, they didn't identify that this had a particular influence in terms of the types of things that troubled them morally or distressed them morally or ethically, or how they reacted or responded to these things. I think the most salient thing to mention here, and there's more detail about this in our report, is I spoke to the influence of identity and life experience in relation to potentially morally injurious events, of course, but the thing that I'll add here is the most salient characteristic or feature here was sex and gender, in that women were more likely to experience harassment, discrimination, were more likely to talk about being treated in sexist ways by colleagues or by patients, derogatory comments, these kinds of things came up quite frequently. And so findings along the lines of sex and gender were a bit more prominent than along other axes of identity. And we didn't have a chance to present those here, but they're articulated in our report, and hopefully people will check them out to find out more.
Perfect. All right, so since we're at the end, I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping up here. First of all, I want to thank you both for being here today and answering all these questions, and thank you to the audience for having so many wonderful questions. Again, if you're going to be at CIMVR Forum, you can certainly go ahead and see the presentation and perhaps ask Dr. Rodriguez a question in person. I'll throw that out there for you. But just a note that we do ask that you please complete the survey that will appear after the town hall is finished. It's important to us to get feedback so we know whether you enjoyed the presentation, whether you found it useful. I also want to let you know that our next town hall is going to be called Underappreciated and Then COVID Came and Stayed. We really hope that you will join us for that. The link for that will appear in your follow-up email, and that will be on November the 10th. CIPSRT and Atlas are both, I think, committed to ensuring that moral injury continues to be explored. And so I want to thank, again, just last thank you for attending today and for sharing this topic with us. And to everyone out there, please take care, stay safe, and we will see you next month. All right, bye.